All right, Abdullah, just a few quick questions. How long after Muhammad did Imam Bukhari live?
A few hundred years.
A few hundred years. And so the narrations that you are depending upon for the establishment of the accuracy of the Quran were collected as long after Muhammad as Codex Sinaiticus was written after the end of the New Testament age, right?
The parallel of the hadith versus the actual scripture of God, I don't buy that. They're two in the Islamic tradition. The hadith and the Quran are not one, so to represent them as one.
I wasn't assuming that. I'm simply saying that I'm simply asking if you can have accurate information that is foundational to your position in Bukhari, and that's collected hundreds of years, and yet you're saying that if Sinaiticus is hundreds of years, that somehow is a problem. It seems to be inconsistent.
So Bukhari was penned 300 years, right? So all Bukhari did was bring the hadith together, bring the authentic narrations of the Prophet, peace be upon him, together into one book. They existed way before Bukhari. In fact, they existed during the time of the Prophet where and this is just one canonical book, right? There's many compilations of hadith prior to Bukhari. He only has a particular special section because of his mode of classification.
Such as Muqatil's collection, right?
There's many.
And yet
Imam Malik's Muwatta was within less than a century of.
But isn't it true that Muqatil is not viewed as having authority because he didn't use the later development of Isnad standards that only come a couple hundred years later?
The Isnad standards existed from right from the beginning. That was core of the Arab and the Islamic tradition in the beginning.
Then
Imam Malik's Muwatta demonstrates that very perfectly.
Then why didn't Muqatil use them?
Imam Malik. So what it is they compiled hadith into a book. Imam Malik's hadith. There's many of Imam Malik's hadith that are also in, for example, Bukhari's hadith or Muslim's hadith. So, for example, let me give this example. In many of Imam Malik's hadith, the chain of narration, because he lived in Medina so close to the death of the Prophet, the chain of narration is 2 people, 3 people, right? So that demonstrates the time lapse between.
Isn't it true that of all the hadith that Bukhari or Muslim examined, that the majority they rejected as not being sahih?
They had a there's levels of classification.
Right. Sahih, Hasan, so on and so forth. But
it's a little bit more than that. Mutawatir,
right.
And that's the highest level of classification, where that's mass transmitted to an extent where by multiple independent chains of narration. Yeah. So it's impossible for all these people to come together and conspire. That level of hadith, there's only a small percentage of them.
Right.
The other hadith, many of them are as you said. Authentic, reliable, weak, fabricated. But this classification system exists because Islamic scholars sought to discern that.
I understand hadith sciences. My point is that there were many hadith that existed at that point in time that had isnad chains that were rejected as being unreliable. Is that not the case?
That's fine. Yeah. Okay.
So it is the case.
Well,
okay.
Yeah, there was a hadith that was rejected because they were not reliable. That's the point. That's why they rejected.
But they all had isnad chains, or they would not even been examined.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So when you say that, for example, let me just make sure that we get a chance to. You said when you gave the standards for Abu Bakr and then Uthman's creation of their mushaf, you said that there had to be multiple witnesses and all the rest of these things. Where are you getting that information from? How long after that event is your earliest reference to that standard?
So you're saying, can I please explain that a little bit further?
So when you very quickly mentioned, and I read the book that you gave to Joash.
I was hoping to actually give that to you, but you can get
I have it in my library. I have a very good library, actually. I've read the book, and the argument there is that, and it's been repeated to me in numerous other debates, is that there was this standard that was in application at that time for the creation of mushaf, including multiple attestation, multiple witnesses, so on and so forth. What I'm asking you is, what is the earliest historical evidence you have to substantiate that claim?
So that narrative, of course, comes from, yes, and I agree, comes from the hadith. But the hadith were written and memorized then and there. They were only brought into books in the later centuries. So certain scholars sought to compile them. So the hadith existed during the time of Abu Bakr, during the time of Omar. So that's within 2 to 20 years.
But your first knowledge of it comes from hundreds of years later.
No, it doesn't. It was the first time it was printed in a book. Printed in a book like that. It comes a couple hundred years later.
And if you just read Bukhari 6, 509 and 510, those standards are not included in that narration by Bukhari, are they?
The standards differ amongst the scholars, but that's fine. So
but the standard about having multiple attestation and witnesses is not found in Bukhari, is it?
I'd have to check that.
Okay, all right. I just want to make sure because that was a very important issue.
I don't think the argument rests on that point though. Okay. On one solitary narration.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about anonymous authors. If Jesus was a prophet, then he would have only quoted from reliable sources. Is that true?
Jesus would, yeah, of course.
Okay. So when Jesus quotes from the broad portion of the Old Testament, and we don't know who wrote many of the sections he quoted from, was he in error for quoting from those sections?
I will clarify that. No, I'm not saying that there's no truth contained within either the Old Testament or the New Testament. I'm just saying I'm putting a question mark in terms of how can we determine that truth. And how can we know? How can we know divine truth? So I can say that generally.
Okay, but that's not what I asked. Jesus said that the scriptures cannot be broken in John chapter 10.
You can't use the New Testament you're taking the New Testament for granted. You can't. That's circular reasoning.
There is no possible way to talk about what Jesus said without going to the quotations of him from the first century.
But that assumes that the New Testament or that quotation is a reliable and authentic quotation of what Jesus said.
And you believe every word about Jesus in the Quran, right?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, and yet there's 600 years between the quotations of Jesus in the Quran and when Jesus lived, and can you show me any historical evidence whatsoever during 600 years that Jesus said those words?
So the challenge brought to man that God makes, we're saying that this book is authored by God, not by Jesus, right? And so God has got eternal knowledge, all-knowing and whatnot. So if we can test that falsification test that God gives all of mankind, we can establish a confident foundation of that text altogether. And in doing so, that answers that question from an epistemological point of view.
So I'm trying to see, because you said we need to use the same standards. You're saying I cannot quote from first century materials written by the disciples of Jesus and say Jesus quoted from this or Jesus quoted from that, but you accept the words of Jesus that are found in the Quran that have absolutely, positively no historical pexgree for 600 years.
That's a really interesting point, the first point. Let's take it one step at a time. Which textual writings of any of the disciples are you referring to that we have at the moment? You said that you mentioned you were referring to the text written by the disciples?
Yes.
Do we have any of them at all?
Well, the specific quotation I gave you is when Jesus said the scriptures cannot be broken in John chapter 10, or I can give you Matthew chapter 22.
I don't believe that, but the reason why I'm questioning it is because you're taking that for granted. So if you're saying that we have the text of the disciples, I think we need to ask that in a more reflective point of view. Do we have the text of the? Actually,
yes. Okay. If you want to
I'll ask the questions when it's my turn.
Please do. If you want to raise any question concerning any of those texts as to their text, I'd be happy to address it. There's no textual variation that's relevant at this point. My point is that we can't have a discussion about what our texts say if you say, well, you can't quote from the New Testament as having relevance to Jesus, but I can quote my text as relevant to Jesus, but I have zero historical, so you just simply have to accept my acceptance of a text that comes 600 years after yours.
My argument was not based on that. The only verse that I mentioned was the verse that asked mankind or challenged mankind to test the veracity of the Quran. I didn't make any reference to Jesus. I didn't make any claim to truth. The only claim to truth that I made was to question the foundation of the text itself.
But I was simply pointing out that Jesus, in the first century documents, quotes from the Old Testament and books that we do not know who their authors are.
Which first century document are you referring to?
The New Testament.
If P52, if I really got the number right, if P52 was within the turn of the 2nd century, and that was the earliest thing we have, what do we have from the 1st century?
We don't have anything from the 1st century.
That's my point.
You would not expect to have anything from the 1st century.
I would be
the closest any other work, I'm sorry, I'm making an argument there. I'll be glad to refute that later on. But, so, do you have any 1st century copies of the Quran? If not, you can't quote from them.
Yeah, the Topaki and the Birmingham manuscript are very, very close within the 1st century.
But neither one of those are complete. So any other sections of the Quran you can't quote from, right?
They're very close. I mean, if we're making a comparison discussion, compared to the complete version of, which is Codex Sinaiticus, that's 3.5 centuries. So
no, but we have the vast majority of the New Testament in the papyri that go to the 2nd, 3rd centuries. You're just not aware of the existence of those books. Okay, but the point is, if you're going to say, but the point is, are you actually saying that we cannot quote from anything in the Gospels unless we have a 1st century manuscript?
I'm not saying you can't. I'm just saying that if you do, you fall into that potential fallacy of you assuming the authenticity of the text to then determine the authenticity of others.
Why aren't you assuming the corruption of the text rather than the authenticity of the text?
No, it's the way logic works, and I'm very sure you're very aware of it. If you're making the claim, you have to substantiate it. I'm asking a question. You're making the claim that it is a faithful representation, so it's the onus of responsibility is for you to demonstrate that it is.
So who are your experts that say that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not 1st century documents?
Textual criticism scholars.
No, not even Bart Ehrman agrees with you. I've debated him.
Actually, I've watched that. That's one debate that I have watched.
That's right. So not even Bart Ehrman believes they're 2nd century documents.
Actually the claim? Well, actually, could you say that claim again, just so I can answer you?
Bart Ehrman does not even argue that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are 2nd century. They're 1st century.
No, I'm not
documents.
arguing that. That's not.
That's what I had asked you. I said, what scholar?
You don't have 1st century material. You don't have Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. You don't have it. You don't even have copies of it.
No one has ever claimed that we do.
Okay,
it's irrelevant to anyone who puts together ancient documents.
I think it's really relevant to this discussion today because if you don't have the original, how can you determine what the original looks like?
Okay, you don't have the original of the Quran, so therefore you can't know what the Quran looks like.
But we have a controlled transmission, and we have a very close original. We have, within 2 years, it was compiled in one book.
But so you're using one standard. You don't know what that book looked like. You're pushing the date of the Mus'haf back so that you can say that you have a 1st century one. If you use that standard, neither one of us can quote our books, right?
No, because we have 2 modes of preservation and transmission, where the New Testament has only got one. Nobody memorized the New Testament. It was passed on story to story, copy to copy, and we have what we have left. And
okay,
that's all we have.
So the writings of the New Testament, writings that outside of the New Testament, such as Clement, the Didache, Ignatius, all these things within 100 years of the original, you just discount their quotations of the New Testament?
That's not the original.
I'm not saying it's the original.
Yeah, but
so you're saying
you can see that there's no original. I'm happy with that.
No one has ever argued otherwise.
Okay.
And no historian has ever argued otherwise. That's why I'm just trying to understand how you don't have an original of the Quran, and you will say, but I can still quote it. And then you say, but you can't quote from anything in the New Testament, even though it's a 1st century document, and we have the earliest attestation of any work of antiquity that goes back to that point.
So
I don't understand how you can say this is consistent.
This is a comparative discussion between the Quran and the Bible. So if we're going to compare it, and maybe if I had a projector, I could draw a table of comparison. Yeah. So we have one that we have the first time we actually even agreed on Matthew, Mark, or the 27 books of the Bible was during the time of Athanasius, so about 3 centuries anyway. Codex Sinaiticus, 3.5 centuries. Compare that to the Quran. Within the first 2 years, it was written in a book. Within 20 years, it was standardized. We had an oral transmission and a written transmission. You only had a written transmission. The earliest manuscript within a century. Earliest full manuscript within 3 centuries. If we're just having a comparative discussion,
why do you keep saying full manuscript? Your top copy is not full. There's missing parts.
We have the Topaki and the Birmingham.
But they're not complete. They're fragments.
They're not fragments. I think that's a very, very
they're fragmentary. They're missing portions.
I mean, if you call
they're missing portions.
If you call like 75% or 80% of it a fragment, I think we got more than that, yeah.
No, you don't need to ring it. We already stopped.
No, please ring it. Yeah. Okay.
We now are going to move into the next 15-minute segment, and this will be led by...
I'm happy to just continue where we left off, mainly because, I'll give you another opportunity to ring that bell anyway. So, given what you mentioned about, I guess I think we've established that the originals don't exist, right? And okay, cool, lovely, good start. Yeah, the originals don't exist. The copies of the originals don't even exist. And the mode of transmission that you described was the free transmission of the text, which I'll read more about in your book, and that editing took place in certain times. There's certain.
What do you mean editing?
So, for example, we mentioned how there was certain insertions or certain parts of the
that's not
that
editing.
We know about. Yeah,
that's not editing.
You don't call that an edit?
No.
Okay.
No,
so
it's real simple. In the ancient world, when you would make a manuscript and you made a mistake and missed something, you would write it in the margin. The copyist, if he could not ask you, if you weren't alive anymore.
That didn't always happen. You know, that's why there's so many differences.
Could I finish the sentence?
Lovely question.
Okay, I need to finish the sentence. And therefore, you had things called glosses. The copyists were conservative, and so they would not want to miss anything. And so, for example, John chapter 5, verse 4 was probably a marginal interpretation that became incorporated in later manuscripts. So that's not editing, because editing would involve the purposeful changing of what is there. This is just simply a copyist doing the best he can to make sure he copies everything that's in the exemplar before him.
Okay. So given, that's essentially the question that we're asking. What reasons do we have to believe that this is... Actually, the first question I should have asked is this, really. Do you believe that the Bible is the inerrant word of God?
I do.
You do. And so and you'd also believe that God does not make any mistakes?
Yes.
Would you also then say God will preserve his word?
He did through the manuscript tradition in a particular fashion, through the free transmission of the text, yes.
So if you qualify preservation as variation that we only were able to determine only after we found Sinaiticus, for example.
You have a very ahistorical understanding of Sinaiticus. It wasn't found just recently. Von Tischendorf was in the 19th century. Codex Vaticanus preceded it. It was known to Erasmus in the 16th century.
So prior to those revelations, how did we understand the text?
They were not revelations.
Prior to those finding out that we found those.
And the Greek manuscript tradition had been going along just fine up until that period of time. So do we have more information upon which to do textual criticism today than we have in the past? Of course. That does not mean that at the time of the Reformation, for example, there was not a perfectly adequate Greek manuscript tradition that communicates the exact same message that we have today. That's what you need to understand, is that these variations do not change the theology of the text. They might change the number of verses that we quote in support of a particular reading, but they do not change the theology of the text, and even Bart Ehrman recognizes that and admits that.
Okay, I'm not Bart Ehrman, so good for him.
But you seem to like his sources.
Oh, yeah, do you really? That's good. What else is there?
But no, you're not Bart Ehrman. You're much nicer than Bart Ehrman.
Oh, lovely, thank you.
I can tell you stories, but I will not take your time to do so.
What else do we have here?
Ask me some more about those variants.
Yeah, I'm coming.
I had to talk way too fast.
All right, so let's just make a direct comparison, yeah? Let's not make a direct comparison between the Bible and the Quran.
Could I point out that I pointed out that we can't do that?
We have to, as best as we possibly can. This is the nature of today's discussion, surely.
But this is where my objection is. There is a 600-year difference. There is a language difference, and we're only if we're talking about the Bible, it's more than 600 years, but if we're just limited to the New Testament, because you keep mentioning Sinaiticus. So you have multiple authors, you have a different language, and you have a 600-year difference. So when we compare them, that always has to be included.
Okay, that's okay. We can still make a comparison.
And the fact that the Quran its initial promulgation is in a time period where people are friendly in the Islamic world to its text, over against 250 years for the New Testament, where the Roman Empire is not friendly to its text at all. There are major differences that have to be historically taken into consideration.
And we can fairly attribute or appreciate the context of either in making that comparison. Yeah.
Yes, very much so.
Okay. So if we can determine the chain of transmission orally and textually, which is the Quran can, how is that a weakness as opposed to a strength? Because what you've described in terms of the mode of transmission for the New Testament in particular, you've highlighted particular challenges, which, if anything, requires more answers, which makes it more difficult, which is the whole point of this discussion, right? Where,
Actually, I think the problem here is that you seem to be interpreting the massive amount of data that we have that no other work of antiquity possesses with it being a problem. What it means is we just have to do harder work.
We have lots of data in the Quran. I don't agree with that assertion that there's. I mean, yeah, in terms of numbers, absolutely, but there's huge amount of data of manuscripts in the centuries for the Islamic narrative across the world.
I am unaware of any catalog.
Well, I should have brought it. I actually have a catalog for you. I should have brought it in.
That includes collations of manuscripts and the citation of variations.
That author Azami, yeah,
yes,
before he passed away,
yes.
He actually published that when we had manuscripts from all 14 centuries of the Islamic civilization from across the world, and he compared word by word.
Is that a question?
No, I'm saying that I'm giving you a reference.
Right. I'm just. My point is that's not the same. That's not how people do textual criticism of ancient documents. And even if we put the Quran into that category, there is no weighting of manuscripts. There is no critical edition where you and I can sit there and look at the manuscripts and analyze what the variants are and what their meaning might be. I do not believe that included the Sa'ana readings at all, did it?
It does. The manuscripts in Yemen. He actually in the book, in the preface, he describes that he had special access to them, and he included it in that.
But included in any collations? I'm answering.
Can I answer one last question?
Let me go back to answer what you actually said. You say, isn't our way superior? And that is assuming the accuracy of the isnad chains and the entire concept of hadith sciences. And my question to you was to point out that, in my understanding, the majority of the hadith that Imam Bukhari or Imam Muslim examined were rejected by them. They all had isnad chains. So simply having an isnad chain, I don't know of anyone outside of Medina or Al-Azhar who thinks that is a truly valid historical mechanism for doing historical study. You want to have manuscripts, you want to have citations of manuscripts, in other words, external writings, Muqatil or someone like that. And yet Muqatil is put off to the side and not allowed to speak to these things because of that artificial application of the isnad concept. So I don't accept the idea that is a greater way of transmitting things. And it does strike me that, again, let's look at the time period. The Quran, in writing, let me put this in the form of an answer. The Quran tells the people of the book that they have nothing to stand on unless they look to their own scriptures, right? Surah 5, as I recall.
It makes a qualification after it says that.
It then talks to in light of Muhammad's revelation of the Quran. Yes, I'm aware of that. But it says that to the people of the book. And then it says to Muhammad, if you have any doubts, talk to those who are reading the scriptures before you. So it seems to me, anyways, that this hyper-skepticism that is the modern Islamic perspective really goes back to Itzar al-Haq and does not go back to Muhammad. Itzar al-Haq. You familiar with the book? 1864 Indian
Oh, no, guys,
scholar.
it predates that. Sure, it predates that far. We have
But the
we have Ibn
hyper-skeptic-
Taymiyyah in the 11th.
But the
13th century.
hyper-skepticism. I
think
know
that's
that
subjective.
Ibn
Well,
Taymiyyah.
I'll give you a couple of quotes that from Orientalist scholars and also a Bible scholar as well. So Orientalist scholar, and I'll finish.
Do I get to respond to them?
Yeah, of course you can. Yeah, I can give it to you if you want anyway. So Orientalist scholar A.T. Welch says. For Muslims, in the Quran is much more than scripture or sacred literature in the usual Western sense. Its primary significance for the vast majority through the centuries has been in its oral form, in the form in which it appeared, as a recitation chanted by Muhammad and his followers over the period of time of about 20 years. And the revelations were memorized by some of Muhammad's followers during his lifetime, and the oral tradition that was thus established also had a continuous history ever since in many independent ways. And also through the written Quran. Through the centuries, the oral tradition of the entire Quran was being maintained by the professional reciters. Until recently, the significance of the recited Quran has seldom been fully appreciated by the West. Now, a Bible scholar, Kenneth Clegg.
Okay, no, wait.
Kenneth Clegg. No,
you're filling the whole time with more citations.
That's
You're cheating a little bit over there. Okay.
I'll go 4 minutes.
Okay, so because as I pointed out, the motivation for the revision under Uthman was differences in citation. You know that there are different arufs as the way it is actually cited. And I am really concerned when I read Bukhari to see that there were entire ayat that were found after the original Abu Bakr collation that were inserted at a later time. Which ones were they? We only know there's one reference given to us, but it's very clear from the narration that there were other ones. Which ones were they? How do we know? There is a lot of questions that are raised as to how you can go from multiple reciters into a written text. And I have sources that are contemporaneous with yours, from Christian sources that knew of the hadith that say that there had been things that were lost by that point in time. So I can go to the same time period and provide quotations if you want me to. We don't have time anymore, but I gave them. They're actually in that little book right next to your elbow, right
Thank
there.
you.
So
take
a look at it.
Just on that point, so you're referencing the hadith sciences or the collection, and then questioning them at the same time. There's many things that Bukhari said as well that we're aware that. So if we can't pick and choose in what we take. The second.
I'm sorry. Did you say we can't pick and choose?
We can't pick and choose. Absolutely not. If you're going to selectively pick and choose and decontextualize certain hadith, that's not how.
Okay, I just want to understand what you're saying. Are you saying that you either take all of Bukhari?
If you're going to take Bukhari as a reliable source of evidence to throw back here, well, then you've got to take the rest of it too. You can't just pick what you potentially and decontextualize that as well.
Could I point out that from my perspective, Bukhari clearly contains really important information. I think 6519 and 510 is particularly important for one simple reason. It's a little bit embarrassing. And that means I think it has greater evidence of being historically accurate, and I can find Bukhari, the core of what Bukhari was saying, in non-Muslim sources. That means it's really, really solid. But are you saying that we cannot critically analyze what sources he would have had?
What I'm saying is that the Islamic tradition, as you've already demonstrated, has a version of textual criticism in the fact that if Bukhari, for example, why did he bother to narrate that if he didn't have a reflective, introspective approach? Right? The Islamic tradition has a reflective, introspective approach to their own texts, which is why certain criticism of certain claims are also preserved within the tradition. And this has been analyzed by scholars. This is not something that is a revelation, if I can use that word.
When you say this has been analyzed by scholars, let me point out, every variant that you've mentioned has been analyzed by scholars all the way back to the early church.
I'm not bringing anything new, if that makes sense, yeah.
That's right. But the way that you presented it, it almost sounded like you were pointing out things that we didn't know. For example, the Kama Yohannium. I mean, no one at the Council of Nicaea quoted the Kama Yohannium in defense of their positions. So obviously, it was not relevant to the early church's
We're allowed to state the obvious in this. I'm not assuming anyone's knowledge on anything. So we can have discussions from first principles. I don't mind doing that. So for that reason, 30 seconds. Thank you very much, Dr. White.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. We're now going to move into a time of some closing remarks. Each speaker is going to be given 5 minutes to bring these, and then at the end we'll bring all of these proceedings to a close. So if James could come and bring his closing remarks first.
I heard someone yawn right then. I'm sorry. Hope that's not a commentary. Oh, White speaking again. Okay, I get a little nap here for 5 minutes. All right. Well, I'm sorry if we got into the weeds a little bit there, but it's going to happen, and it needs to happen, and I'm glad you were here to observe it. It can be done without people flying over desks and attacking other people and beating them with books and things like that. This is a very important discussion, and what it does highlight, my fellow Christians, those of you in the audience who are, is the need for us to know the history of our text. I have for over 30 years been seeking to, and I don't think you're 30 years old yet, right? I'll take that, okay. I have for over 30 years been seeking to educate Christians about the history of their text, to realize that it was given to them in a particular fashion. The book of Romans was once a papyrus that was in a leather bag being carried by a man along the dusty roads to Rome, and that man had never heard of deodorant. It happened in history. You need to understand that. And for a long period of time, longer than the Quran, that was transmitted to us in handwritten copies. Now, thankfully, we have very excellent early manuscripts of the New Testament. And in fact, I didn't get a chance to do this. Let me just point one out. We have one Gospels manuscript that contains almost all of Luke and John, called P75. And we can tell by the readings that P75 is related to Codex Vaticanus. So P75 is about 175 AD. Codex Vaticanus is about 325, 350. They both go to a preceding ancestor. Vaticanus is not a copy of P75, we know that. But they both had an ancestor. That means that when P75 and Vaticanus have the same reading, that reading goes back to at least 150, probably 125, as early as P52, the little credit card that has been mentioned numerous times before. But P75 is entire books. It's not just a little shred. So you see, we have in the papyri far more information than I think Abdullah is familiar with in regards to that period of time. But the reality is, if you use the standard that I think he was using, and that is, you either need to have the originals, we do not claim to, or you have to have something from the first century. Was that the first century 100 years after the time of the writings? Well, if Paul's writing as late as 60, that's 160, we're getting pretty close with something like that. But why is that? And who made up that rule? And if you follow that, we know nothing about history. Because our history, our knowledge of Rome, is based upon Pliny and Tacitus and Suetonius. And the earliest manuscripts we have of anything they wrote are at least 500 to 900 years later. That means you can't quote any of those things. We don't know anything about history. That's why I was saying this is not how scholars do history. This is not how scholars do textual criticism. The fact that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, they're all first century documents is really not disputed by almost anyone. They are first century documents, and given that when we begin to have the early attestation of them, guess what? They all say the same thing. Oh, but there's a word different here, a word different there. I remember an atheist asking Bart Ehrman on a show once, so, Dr. Ehrman, in light of all the textual variants, what do you think the New Testament was originally all about? And Bart Ehrman's like, it was about Jesus as the Son of God coming and dying on the cross and rising again for the salvation of the world? And the atheist is like, aww. He thought it was like space aliens or something like that. But the point is, Ehrman knows, anyone who studies textual criticism knows, that the manuscript tradition is united in the fact that it presents one message. And here's the key issue. The message it presents was not known to the author of the Quran. He did not know what Paul taught about Jesus. He did not know what John taught about Jesus. There is no evidence whatsoever that he was aware of that. And yet all the manuscripts, from wherever they come from, contain the same message, the same gospel. That really is one of the key issues that hopefully has been made clear this evening, that you all get to think about more, because this is just the beginning of a conversation, not the end of the conversation. And I thank you for being here to listen to it. Thank you.
That was it. Thank you for the opportunity to engage with Dr. White. It's someone I've watched or I've grown up at least 30 years of. I'm a bit younger than that. So it's a privilege to share this platform with him, and I echo the point on history. I had actually before I do that, before I forget, I think Dr. White's a very big fan of Bart Ehrman, and if he is, you should go check him out. But the point about history, actually after the debate we had at Monash, a good friend of mine, Rob, he might be in the crowd here, sent me a video or something to listen to, and the speaker, the first thing he said was that a lot of Christians go to secular universities and learn about the Bible, and they lose faith in it once they go into textual criticism for many reasons, and he might be wrong on that. But the point was, what I took from that is the importance of knowing our history and being academically faithful and academic in it, in doing so. And so the history is really, really rich. History doesn't come from one perspective, and there are many perspectives and many conclusions that are brought forth. I wanted this particular discussion not to be one about necessarily about faith per se, more about a historical accuracy, right? In the sense that people believe in whatever they like to believe for whatever reasons they like to believe. That's fine, right? And maybe perhaps many people associate religion in that way as well. But in terms of if we're going to have an academic comparative discussion, you almost have to sort of take that away a little bit in order to do that. Now, I'd like to end with that, or to highlight that the Islamic history is incredibly rich and incredibly informative and scientific in the sense that it can be audited, if that makes sense. So the history is attested to by multiple chains of narration of reliable sources, not just having the chain in and of itself. And these reliable sources can be known and audited to this day, coupled with a textual tradition. I think that's incredibly strong and incredibly reliable, irrespective of what you think of the contents of the book. At the very, very least, you can conclude that with beyond reasonable doubt that at least that there's a faithful transmission of what we had. And that's what I sought to present today, that at the very, very least we can demonstrate that within 2 years of the death of the Prophet we can demonstrate the compilation and the preservation of the revelation. Now, in terms of the New Testament, naturally there's questions around it, but as a Muslim, I don't necessarily expect the New Testament to have been preserved anyway, because God never promised to do that with that particular revelation, and that the Quran was brought for all of mankind as the criterion between truth and falsehood. And so the Quran came to confirm the scriptures before it, including the Gospels, right? And what I mean Gospels is the revelation brought down to the messenger, Jesus, peace be upon him. And so in that way the Quran acts as a guardian over them, and I encourage you to read, learn, open up the Quran and learn a little bit more about it, just as much as you do for your Bible. So thank you very much again, and I'll get my autograph soon. Take care.
Just one more time, that you had 1 more minute. Thank you.